The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 5. True and False Subjectivism. The subjective stage of human development is that critical juncture in which, having gone forward from symbols, types, conventions, having turned its gaze superficially on the individual being to discover his truth and right law of action, and its relation to the superficial and external truth and law of the universe, our race begins to gaze deeper, to see and feel what is behind the outside and below the surface, and therefore to live from within. It is a step towards self-knowledge and towards living in and from the self, away from knowledge of things as the not-self, and from the living according to this objective idea of life and the universe. Everything depends on how that step is taken, to what kind of subjectivity we arrive, and how far we go in self-knowledge. For here the dangers of error are as great and far-reaching as the results of right seeking. The symbolic, the typal, the conventional age avoid these dangers by building a wall of self-limitation against them. And it is because this wall becomes, in the end, a prison of self-ignorance that it has to be broken down, and the perilous but fruitful adventure of subjectivism undertaken. A psychic self-knowledge tells us that there are in our being many formal, frontal, apparent, or representative selves, and only one that is entirely secret and real. To rest in the apparent and to mistake it for the real is the one general error, root of all others, and cause of all our stumbling and suffering, to which man is exposed by the nature of his mentality. We may apply this truth to the attempt of man to live by the law of his subjective being, whether as an individual or as a social unit, one in its corporate mind and body. For this is the sense of the characteristic turn which modern civilization is taking. Everywhere we are beginning, though still sparsely and in a groping, tentative fashion, to approach things from the subjective standpoint. In education, our object is to know the psychology of the child as he grows into man, and to found our systems of teaching and training upon that basis. The new aim is to help the child to develop his intellectual, aesthetic, emotional, moral, spiritual being, and his communal life and impulses out of his own temperament and capacities. A very different object from that of the old education, which was simply to pack so much stereotyped knowledge into his resisting brain and impose a stereotyped rule of conduct on his struggling and dominated impulses. Here we have a footnote. There has been a rude setback to this development in totalitarian states, whose theory is that the individual does not exist, and only the life of the community matters. But this new, larger view still holds its own in freer countries. In dealing with the criminal, the most advanced societies are no longer altogether satisfied with regarding him as a lawbreaker to be punished, imprisoned, terrified, hanged, or else tortured physically and morally, whether as a revenge for his revolt or as an example to others. There is a growing attempt to understand him, to make allowance for his heredity, environment, and inner deficiencies, and to change him from within, rather than crush him from without. In the general view of society itself, we begin to regard the community, the nation, or any other fixed grouping of men as a living organism with a subjective being of its own and a corresponding growth and natural development, which it is its business to bring to perfection and fruition. So far, good. The greater knowledge, the truer depth, the wiser humanity of this new view of things are obvious. But so also are the limitations of our knowledge and experience on this new path, and the possibility of serious errors and stumblings. If we look at the new attempt of nations, whether subject or imperial, to fulfill themselves consciously, and especially at the momentous experiment of the subjective German nationality, we shall see the starting point of these possible errors. The first danger arises from the historical fact of the evolution of the subjective age out of the individualistic. And the first enormous stumble has accordingly been to transform the error of individualistic egoism into the more momentous error of a great communal egoism. The individual seeking for the law of his being can only find it safely if he regards clearly two great psychological truths and lives in that clear vision. First, the ego is not the self. There is one self of all, and the soul is a portion of that universal divinity. The fulfillment of the individual is not the utmost development of his egoistic intellect, vital force, physical well-being, and the utmost satisfaction of his mental, emotional, physical cravings, but the flowering of the divine in him to its utmost capacity of wisdom, power, love, and universality, and through this flowering his utmost realization of all the possible beauty and delight of existence. The will to be, the will to power, the will to know are perfectly legitimate. Their satisfaction the true law of our existence, and to discourage and repress them improperly is to mutilate our being and dry up or diminish the sources of life and growth. But their satisfaction must not be egoistic, not for any other reason, moral or religious, but simply because they cannot so be satisfied. The attempt always leads to an eternal struggle with other egoisms, a mutual wounding and hampering, even a mutual destruction, in which, if we are conquerors today, we are the conquered or the slain tomorrow. For we exhaust ourselves and corrupt ourselves in the dangerous attempt to live by the destruction and exploitation of others. Only that which lives in its own self-existence can endure. And generally, to devour others is to register oneself also as a subject and predestined victim of death. No doubt, so long as we live without self-knowledge, we can do no other. Men and nations have to act and think egotistically, because in their self-ignorance, that is the only life known to them. And to live is their God-given impulse. Therefore they must live egoistically, rather than not at all, with whatever curb of law, ethics, and practical common sense of self-restraint, nature, and experience have taught them. But subjectivism is, in its very nature, an attempt at self-knowledge, and at living by a true self-knowledge, and by an inner strength. And there is no real gain in it if we only repeat the old error in new terms. Therefore we must find out that the true individual is not the ego, but the divine individuality, which is through our evolution preparing to emerge in us. Its emergence and satisfaction, and not the satisfaction of the mere egoistic will to live for the sake of one's lower members, is the true object at which a humanity subjectively seeking to know and fulfill its own deepest law and truth should increasingly aim. The second psychic truth the individual has to grasp is this, that he is not only himself, but is in solidarity with all of his kind. Let us leave aside for the moment that which seems to be not of his kind. That which we are has expressed itself through the individual, but also through the universality. And though each has to fulfill itself in its own way, neither can succeed independently of the other. The society has no right to crush or efface the individual for its own better development or self-satisfaction. The individual, so long at least as he chooses to live in the world, has no right to disregard, for the sake of his own solitary satisfaction and development, his fellow beings, and to live at war with them, or seek a selfishly isolated good. And when we say no right, it is from no social, moral, or religious standpoint, but from the most positive, and simply with a view to the law of existence itself. For neither the society nor the individual can so develop to their fulfillment. Every time the society crushes or effaces the individual, it is inflicting a wound on itself and depriving its own life of priceless sources of stimulation and growth. The individual, too, cannot flourish by himself, for the universal, the unity and collectivity of his fellow beings, is his present source and stock. It is the thing whose possibilities he individually expresses, even when he transcends its immediate level, and of which, in his phenomenal being, he is one result. Its depression strikes eventually at his own sources of life. By its increasing, he also increases. This is what a true subjectivism teaches us. First, that we are a higher self than our ego or our members. Secondly, that we are in our life and being not only ourselves, but all others. For there is a secret solidarity which our egoism may kick at and strive against, but from which we cannot escape. It is the old Indian discovery that our real I is a supreme being, which is our true self, and which it is our business to discover and consciously become. And secondly, that being is one in all, expressed in the individual and in the collectivity. And only by admitting and realizing our unity with others can we entirely fulfill our true self-being. There is a footnote. There is another side of the truth, in which this interdependence is not so imperative, but that is a phenomenon of spiritual evolution, which has nothing to do with the present subject. Of these two truths, mankind has had some vague vision in the principle with regard to the individual, though it has made only a very poor and fragmentary attempt to regard them in practice, and in 9/10 of its life has been busy departing from them, even where it outwardly professed something of the law. But they apply not only to the individual, but to the nation. Here was the first error of the German subjectivism, reasoning of the absolute and the individual and the universal. It looked into itself and saw that, in fact, as a matter of life, that seemed to express itself as the ego, and reasoning from the conclusions of modern science, it saw the individual merely as a cell of the collective ego. This collective ego was, then, the greatest actual organized expression of life, and to that all ought to be subservient, for so could nature and its evolution best be assisted and affirmed. The greater human collectivity exists, but it is an inchoate and unorganized existence, and its growth can best be developed by the better development of the most efficient, organized collective life already existing. Practically, then, by the growth, perfection, and domination of the most advanced nations, or possibly of the one most advanced nation. the collective ego, which has best realized the purpose of nature, and whose victory and rule is therefore the will of God. For all organized lives, all self-conscious egos are in a state of war, sometimes overt, sometimes covert, sometimes complete, sometimes partial, and by the survival of the best is secured the highest advance of the race. And where was the best, which was the most advanced, self-realizing, efficient, highest cultured nation, if not, by common admission, as well as in Germany's own self-vision, Germany itself?